Hello, my name is Jesbia Mahil and I am a creativity researcher and writer. I use a systems thinking conceptual framework for my research, and the purpose of this session is to outline some of the key features of this approach. I'll be looking at two questions about systems thinking. First of all, what are the key features of a systems thinking conceptual framework? And then I will explain some of the limitations of this approach that need to be overcome. Complexity of a system is an essential feature. What do we mean by a system? Skidner illustrates at least 9 types of systems using Boulding's hierarchy of systems complexity. Systems can be both material and non-material, and they can range from frameworks such as the arrangement of atoms in a crystal to transcendental systems at the most complex level, where the unknowable is presupposed to exhibit structure and relationship. When we reflect or make interpretations about a system, we need to consider its level of complexity. Systems are usually framed as networks rather than hierarchies. Capra and Luisi argue that since living systems at all levels are networks, we must visualize the web of life as living systems or networks. They argue that hierarchies and pyramids are a human projection and that in nature there's no such above or below. However, not everyone agrees that networks are a more natural or organic way of structuring our organizational, community and societal relationships. For example, Professor Jordan Peterson, author of 12 Rules for Life, gives examples of natural hierarchies used in the animal kingdom. He draws on the social hierarchies of chimpanzees and lobsters, who use hierarchies to exert dominance over their peers. Systems thinking is more focused on relationships rather than inanimate objects, and Capra and Luisi advise that it's more appropriate to map these relationships, to identify patterns and configurations rather than attempting to measure and weigh them. Jackson and McCurgo suggest that the act of attempting to map interactions in a system can be an expression of creativity, stimulating useful debate leading to further actions. Another important aspect of systems thinking is the assumption that small changes in a system can cause huge effects. This is demonstrated in the popular story called The Butterfly Effect, based on a paper written by meteorologist Lorenz, where he poses the rhetorical question: does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? Senge claims that indeed small changes can produce big results, but the areas of highest leverage are often the least obvious. He explains that small, well-focused actions can sometimes produce significant, enduring improvements if they're in the right place. When we analyse the famous lives of Gandhi, Picasso and Freud, amongst others, they seem to demonstrate that the small paradigm shifts they persuaded their societies to adopt, gaining leverage, created cultural transformations in the world of politics, art and psychology. Senge highlights the importance of seeing events within their context, warning that you can only understand the system of a rainstorm by contemplating the whole, not any individual part of the pattern. He illustrates this metaphorically, explaining that a cloud masses, the sky darkens, leaves twist upward, and we know that it will rain. We also know that after the storm, the runoff will feed into groundwater miles away, and the sky will grow clear by tomorrow. All these events are distant in time and space, and yet they're all connected within the same patterns. Each has an influence on the rest, an influence that is usually hidden from view. You can only understand the system of a rainstorm by contemplating the whole, not any individual part of the pattern. The systems thinking belief that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts is an idea that Borges reminds us was common to the thinking of ancient Greeks, many of whom held that a whole, for example, a body, was greater than the sum of its parts. In the mid-20th century, Fitzgerald notes that the basic idea behind general systems theory, which was seen to be the first science of wholes, was that a complex organism could not be truly understood by breaking it down into and studying its apparent parts. To do so was to overlook the crucial relationship between its components. This concept is further illustrated by Senge with another metaphor, arguing that dividing an elephant in half does not produce two small elephants, and that when people do divide an elephant in half, you don't have two small elephants, then you have a mess. Senge explains that it's important to see the whole rather than fragmented bits of the context so that we're able to see the consequences of our actions and experience our connection to the world around us in a broader context. In a similar vein, Capra and Luisi argue that the properties of the parts are not intrinsic properties, but can be understood only within the context of the larger whole. Whereas analysis entails breaking something apart into smaller bits, systems thinking involves putting the object of our focus into a broader context. Within the concept that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts is implicit the theory that cause and effect are not necessarily linear relationships, and in fact Senge argues that cause and effect are not closely related in time and space. This view is supported by Kraft, Dougal et al., who explain how the tendency to see events through simplistic linear cause-effect relationships can be problematic because it overlooks the complexity of multi-directional influences in societal relationships. The concept of non-linear cause and effect relationships is further endorsed by Capra and Luisi in reference to their paradigm of networks. They explain that a message may travel along a cyclical path which may become a feedback loop. The suggestion of straight lines between causes supposedly leading directly to effects is questioned by systems thinkers such as Senge, who posit that reality is made up of circles, but we see straight lines. Smith echoes this importance of circular relationships, explaining that a set of interdependent variables forms a circular relationship. Each variable co-produces the others and in turn is co-produced by the others. Which one comes first is irrelevant because none can exist without the others. They have to happen all at the same time. The concept of circularity can be applied in both tangible and intangible processes, as demonstrated by Borges, proposing that all physical objects are products of constant circular processes, and also that conceptual knowledge is circular. We know everything in reference to something else. The concept of circularity in systems thinking discourages making interpretations in isolation or based on seemingly isolated events. Patterns of circular relationships between cause and effect are easier to see when we take into consideration the whole context instead of analysing its parts mechanistically. Systems thinking seeks to understand and discover new knowledge through synthesis rather than analysis. Aronson contrasts analysis and synthesis by explaining that analysis breaks and separates individual pieces of the subject being researched, whereas synthesis looks at the interactions between these individual pieces within a larger and larger context. The importance of synthesis is also advocated by Skinner, who explains that systems are wholes which cannot be understood through analysis inasmuch as their primary properties derive from the interactions of their parts. Moreover, he argues that synthesis takes the steps of analytical science in reverse order, explaining that Synthesis is a prerequisite for the systems thinking of our time, just as analysis was for the mechanistic era. A system, inasmuch as it's a whole, will lose its synergetic properties if it's decomposed. It cannot be understood through analysis. Understanding must therefore progress from the whole to its parts, a synthesis. Another advocate of the systems thinking approach, making comparisons between Newtonian-style thinking associated with the mechanistic era, is Fitzgerald, who reminds us that Isaac Newton thought of the building blocks of reality as hard, solid, inert, purposeless, and ultimately irreducible material objects. Like Newton, protagonists of mechanistic thinking seem to believe that we can discover truth through analysis and breaking things down to their smallest components. In contrast, arguing in favour of a systems thinking approach, Fitzgerald laments that, alas, the materialist credo of reductionism has become so deeply embedded in the Western psyche that a great many of us remain ignorant of the emergence of a new science, one that would liberate us from the close confines of the Newtonian mindset. Language and perception are key components in gaining understanding and awareness through a systems thinking perspective. Senge explains that language shapes perception. What we see depends on what we are prepared to see. Western languages, with their subject, verb, object structure, are biased toward a linear view. If we want to see system-wide interrelationships, we need a language of interrelationships, a language made up of circles. The impact of language syntax and structure is also noted by Borsch, who explains that our language starts with nouns, verbs come later. He argues that our thinking processes prioritize things first and relationships later, generally ignoring the context. Languages that constrict us to follow a linear structure, where a sentence only makes sense if it follows rigid rules, may distort our perception, unless, as advocated by the systems thinking approach, we take into consideration a broader worldview where a diverse range of languages may indeed present an enriched contextual understanding and awareness. Feedback mechanisms are seen to be a core aspect of systems thinking. Senge explains that there are two distinct types of feedback processes, reinforcing and balancing. Reinforcing or amplifying feedback processes are the engines of growth. Whenever you're in a situation where things are growing, you can be sure that reinforcing feedback is at work. And balancing or stabilizing feedback operates whenever there is a goal-oriented behavior. If the goal is to be not moving, then balancing feedback will act the way the brakes in a car do. If the goal is to be moving at 60 miles per hour, then balancing feedback will cause you to accelerate to 60, but no faster. Senge highlights the importance of these feedback mechanisms in systems thinking, saying that all ideas of the language of systems thinking are built up from these elements, just as English sentences are built up from nouns and verbs. The importance of feedback mechanisms in systems thinking is also emphasized by Capra and Luisi, using popular examples to illustrate the impact, such as the invisible hand regulating the market in the economic theory of Adam Smith and the checks and balances of the US Constitution. They suggest that the phenomenon described by these models and metaphors all imply circular patterns of causality that can be represented by feedback. Emergence is another key aspect in systems thinking, described by Capra and Luisi as the novel properties that arise when a higher level of complexity is reached by putting together components of lower complexity. These new properties are not present in the parts. They emerge as a result of the relationships and interactions between the parts. For example, animated films are composed of thousands of static pictures which are shown in sequence at such a fast speed that apparent motion is created. Similarly, Jackson and McCurgo note that in the emergent paradigm, systems are again characterized by interactions between the component parts, but rather than being inherently designable, these interactions are of a complex, interweaving, and self-referential nature, which means that the net effect of all the interactions is impossible to predict accurately in advance. Emergent properties are not always positive or welcome. For example, Jackson and McCurgo have found that sometimes in organizations, the consequence is fragmented, messy, informal structures that no one designed. They emerged. Sometimes patterns of behavior can emerge that are destructive rather than supportive, and these negative patterns of behavior can have an undermining impact on corporate culture. A further characteristic of systems is their temporality. Every system is changing constantly in response to actions and interactions in a circular process. Borsch explains that temporality is seen in all aspects of reality. All kinds of living systems, including psychic and social systems, undergo constant circular processes, reshaping themselves in response to new situations and with every act of communication. Nothing is permanent in systems. To summarize, we've looked at 12 key features of systems thinking: complexity, networks rather than hierarchies, relationships rather than objects, mapping instead of measuring, the fact that small changes can lead to huge impact with the correct leverage, that the whole is greater than the sum of its part, so context is essential, that we need to look at circular rather than linear relationships, synthesis is more important than analysis, language has an impact on perception, feedback is very important, and we need to notice the emergent characteristics, and everything in systems thinking is temporal. Everything changes, nothing remains the same. Now let's look at some of the limitations of systems thinking. I'll explain 3 of these limitations. First of all, that structure influences behavior. Secondly, the impact of power imbalances. And thirdly, ethical issues. A fundamental concept in systems thinking is that structure influences behavior. Senge explains that when placed in the same system, people, however different, tend to produce similar results. He urges us to look into the underlying structures which shape individual actions and create the conditions where types of events become likely. This concept causes controversy as it undermines individual freedom of choice and responsibility and accountability for actions taken. For example, it seems to imply that anyone who finds themselves in a dysfunctional system may inevitably behave in a dysfunctional way in response. Numerous examples could be cited to demonstrate that this clearly is not always the case. For example, some people behaved nobly within a ruthless Nazi system, whereas we have prisons full of criminals in practically every societal system, which indicates that even though these segregated citizens are part of the same system, those in prison fail to behave in the same way as those who are not in prison. So the claim that people behave the same way, producing similar results, if they're in the same location in a system, is evidently exaggerated. Another limitation of the systems thinking framework is that it overlooks relations of power in systems. Borsch criticizes the inadequacy of systems thinking in dealing with situations where there is an imbalance of power relations. He notes the philosophical objections made by Habermas, who criticizes systems theory for being biased towards a technocratic, mechanistic ideology at the expense of humanistic concerns. These philosophical objections of Habermas to systems thinking are also highlighted by Capra and Luisi, who note that for Habermas, the social system has to do with the ways social structures constrain people's actions, which includes issues of power and specifically the class relationships involved in production. Not only is systems thinking criticized for failing to acknowledge the power imbalance in structures, but also for only focusing on the exterior half of systems. For example, Fitzgerald argues that we do not have access to the interior part of the system. You can look inside a system all you want using the latest and greatest of assessment technology, but all you'll ever see is more of its exterior, the greater surface span, and not its elusive, ethereal and irreducible within. There are potential ethical issues in relying on systems thinking to draw conclusions about each person's role within the system. For example, if the implication is that each individual is a puppet being played rather than a conscious being with complex internal, unwitnessed forces that they freely choose to exercise. Borsch discusses the philosophical debate about the importance of free personal agency on one hand and the importance of impersonal laws that protect individual and community rights on the other, by drawing on the debate between two eminent philosophers, Habermas and Luhmann. Habermas claims that applications of systems theory tend to repress free personal agency because they operate mechanically without recourse to common sense, democratic discourse, and social justice. Luhmann counters that the complexity of pluralistic societies precludes normative consensus in the particulars of contested situations. Moreover, impersonal positive laws are the safeguards of individual and community rights. Finally, insistence on personal norms in social contexts is a remnant of dysfunctional metaphysical narrow-mindedness. The objections of Habermas are also noted by Capra and Luisi. For example, his assertion that people's interpretations always rely on a number of implicit assumptions that are embedded in history and tradition. Systems thinking doesn't take into consideration an individual's historic identity, which may leave invisible imprints in actions and reactions that are witnessed. Moreover, Capra and Luisi acknowledge Habermas's critique that systems thinking fails to identify ideological distortions and power relations that distort communication. Systems thinking doesn't easily counter Habermas's objections that certain unspoken premises underlie every attempt to communicate. Borsch believes that this has ethical implications as it may undermine an individual or group's resistance to oppression. For example, as he says, by a rampaging technocracy that regards functionality as its chief value. The criticisms of Habermas are mainly based around the impact of power and language, which systems thinking doesn't fully explain in drawing conclusions about interactions and feedback mechanisms in the systemic processes. In an attempt to counteract this criticism, an advocate of systems thinking, Luhmann, claims that Society is coterminous with human communication. Luhmann believes that society is insulated from individual or collective influences because it is a self-referential system that develops autonomously, and the psychic, unconscious forms of communication that Habermas argues are overlooked by systems thinking are in fact a part of society, as it's an all-inclusive entity. In this session, we've looked at 12 key features of the systems thinking conceptual framework. These are the 12 features we've looked at. Some of the limitations of systems thinking are that it assumes that structure influences behaviour to an extent that it diminishes our personal responsibility and accountability for our behaviour. It doesn't take into account power imbalances that distort communication, and our freedom of choice as individuals is overlooked. I hope you've enjoyed this video about systems thinking. Hope you found it useful, and please do contact me for further support if you're using systems thinking as a conceptual framework for your research. You can subscribe to my channel here and contact me by emailing me at jesvia@universityforlife.com. Let me know if you have any questions or feedback for me. All the best to you.